All right. Welcome to another episode of The Close Up, part of the Orlando Magic HQ network. I'm your host, Stephen Cameron, and today we have a really fun episode. We have Arnie Kander, Vice President of Player Performance and Wellness for the Orlando Magic on. He and I have an awesome conversation. We get to learn a little bit more about Arnie and how his journey in sports medicine and wellness kicked off. It's a very unique story. He very much went about his journey by asking the right questions, or asking questions that were curious to him, and just following this curiosity path, which is really cool to hear him talk about because, I just feel like with a life's journey, you learn a lot you probably learn more about asking questions and then you do just trying to find answers without asking questions. Like, it's just asking the right questions is just a theme that's been on my mind a lot recently. And I feel like Arnie does that often in the early parts of career, which really impacted him and his journey and where he's at today in his life. And it's just really cool to hear him talk about that. And then, we also talk about other parts of his practice and how he goes about, player development and player health, starting with his relationships with the players in the first place. It's just a really cool story and a really fun conversation that we had. I do want to apologize. The meeting with Arnie was recorded on Zoom, so the audio might be a little bit different than what you're used to, but we will work with that, and it's still very much audible and listenable, and I think you guys will enjoy it, but just wanted to give a little sub note there that there was a little bit, just a different operation this time around. Before we get to the conversation, let's just quickly do our homework. This podcast was brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything online sports betting. Right now, you can earn 50% free bet up to $250 on your first deposit to bet on anything from the Olympics to basketball to baseball to Formula One racing. BetOnline has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. When the games are over, head over to our online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker, or unwind with one of their over 150 slot games. Head to the website today and get in on the action. Use promo code BLEAV, that's BLEAV, for your 50% free bet credit on your first deposit up to $250. BetOnline, the game starts here. And you heard in that the promo is BLEAV, BLEAV. That's because we are part of the Believe Podcast Network, which we are super psyched on as an organization at Orlando Magic HQ. They've been great partners to us, so make sure you check out the rest of their content as well. All right. I don't really have much else to say. I honestly just want you guys to get to this conversation as fast as possible with Arnie. It was awesome. Big shout out to Arnie for taking a few moments out of his day to chat with me. It was really good conversation. I hope you all enjoy. All right, Magic fans, like I said, we got Arnie Kander, Vice President of Player Performance and Wellness. Arnie, thank you so much for joining the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Stephen. Thank you for having me on this show. Look forward to it.
Yeah, it's going to be a really fun conversation. I have a lot of questions. We'll kind of break this up into multiple different segments, but as I was thinking about our conversation that we were going to have today, I kind of was first stepping back, thinking about a fan perspective outside of a media presence where, I come in and try and balancing that too. And, as a fan, I've noticed myself and the fan base, obviously we have an appreciation and a connection with the players because we see them so often in interviews and on the court and things like that. And we get to hear a little bit more about their personalities and whatnot. But the fan base also really gets attached to the coaching staff and the rest of the player staff. And, any chance we get to learn a little bit more about them, I think it just helps us feel even more connected to the, just to the organization as a whole. So I'm really excited to just kind of like break in a little bit more into who Arnie Kander is and just your background and your history throughout the NBA, and kind of then towards the end we'll get towards some Magic specific stuff. Arnie, I think it's known that you come with a fun approach. You do things a little bit differently than I think a lot of people would expect. You're often bringing people to, like, players to unique locations like Boulder and different outdoor experiences. And we've even seen some rock climbing. But before we get to even all that, like, what was your upbringing like when you were in grade school and high school? Were you into basketball? Where did you grow up? How kind of did you like get into like this basketball niche and health and wellness?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So I've got a little more gray now. So this goes back a few years ago. So I definitely played basketball, was a pretty good hooper through junior high school, had a knee injury, which kind of led me on my path of experimentation, trying to figure out ways. I remember going to a PT clinic, and I was the guy that would drive everybody crazy. Like, hey, explain when I'm doing a step back or I'm dribbling through, how do I control alignment of my hip and my knee? And they're looking at me like, well, like, just get on this machine and strengthen your quad or your hamstring. I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense. I want to understand the kind of the joint mechanics, how the body moves, any mind processing. Like, I wanted to, even at 16, 17, think outside the box. So I was reading at the time. There wasn't the internet. This is back in the late 70s. And so for me, it was this guy by the name of Willie Gault. And Willie Gault was an elite sprinter, fastest human being in the world. The Chicago Bears brought him in as I think a kick returner because of his speed. And he wrote an article, probably in Sports Illustrated. And the article basically said he studied classical dance. And it improved his 100-meter dash, or maybe it was 100 yards back then, by a tenth of a second, which for anybody who knows sprinting, that's pretty incredible. So I made a trek to Chicago. I was 17, and I met Willie Gault. And I said, would you mind, having a soda with me, and we could chat a little bit about like this world of dance, to explain. And he goes, well, dance is about alignment. Dance is about centering. Dance is about breath. Dance is about optimal putting yourself in a position to produce this incredible power output. And it clicked. I'm like, wow. So I came back. I was living in Michigan, and actually used dance because my knee still wasn't doing great from the therapy, the PT. It just wasn't responding. And I went and signed up for a local ballet class. It was probably the worst, obviously terrible, absolutely terrible. No sense of alignment, no sense of center, no sense of a good plie, any of that. But after about 4 months of going back to those dance classes, I started seeing a huge difference. Number one, my knee was normal. Like, everything responded. My alignment was much better. My sense of like, wow, this is like doing something to me that the traditional PT was not doing. And so kind of made a pact to myself at a young age, never be limited by traditional approach. So whether that's ballet, I learned Tai Chi as a young person growing up. So form of martial arts, yoga, meditation, breath work, whatever it is with an athlete. So that was kind of the starting point for me of utilizing even something as simple as dance. And then I learned more about modern dance and Jose Limon, Martha Graham, all these incredible practitioners that talked about how this word core, right, has become this kind of overused word we hear. Well, in dance, core is it's life. Like, it's what you do with every single movement you make. And then being able to breathe while you go through these very complex movement patterns and hold your confidence, your calm, your center. Incredible learning for me at a very young age. But what it did was that I need to go back and learn this at a different level. And that's where I went to PT school. But I came in slightly different than most other students. I came in with this yearning to understand this side. But within that, what was really cool was I learned that the key for me, beyond just how do I understand movement, was the brain. So I ended up studying at a place called Ranchos Los Amigos, which is this really big neuro institute in California. And Dr. Jacqueline Perry was the head of the GATE lab. So I started to learn neurological patterns, like how do people with a stroke, how do people with a spinal cord injury, how do people with very advanced with neuromuscular diseases move? And if I can learn it with that, how is it going to be when I bring it back to sport? So if I can teach somebody who's had a severe stroke how to move and how to advance based upon this brain nerve connection, imagine being able to bring that back to somebody who can jump 42 inches off the ground or can reach speeds of 22 miles an hour or can do these particular force plate data analysis. It was like another aha moment, like, wow, like what a cool thing. So it kind of was the start for me. And then I give the credit of bringing me to the NBA by a guy by the name of Isaiah Thomas, the original bad boy, Isaiah Thomas. So I met him years ago in the late 80s and started doing some things with him. And he said, did you ever consider coming to the NBA? And I'm like, to do what? Like, what would you want me to do in the NBA? He goes, well, you'd be an amazing strength and conditioning coach, PT. So I said, sure, and I'll give you a fascinating story. They brought me in, this is in the late 80s, and it was day 4 of two-a-days. And they said, okay, this is your day to come in. So this is how medical groups used to only be a trainer. That's all there was a trainer and one team doctor. That was an entire medical performance group. So they brought me in on day 4. And the reason why I'm saying it is when I walked in, you see Joe Dumars and Bill Lambier and Dennis Rodman, Ricky Mahorn, John Sally, the whole group, all with ice and ice and ice everywhere. Anywhere there's a body part, there's ice. And they're like, Arnie, they're all yours. Take them through a workout. I'm looking at them like, well, nobody gave me any data. Nobody gave me anything to analyze as a scientist to be able to determine what I would do. And I realized they've had two-a-days, 3 days in a row, and they had a morning practice. So I was catching them in their 8th workout, which in today's day and age, number one, it's not allowed. Number two, they can't even move. They can't even walk. So I said, perfect. I had everything set up in this massive weight room. And I quickly veered left. I said, do you have a ballroom? And they're like, yeah, what do you need it for? I said, I just need a ballroom. Just give me a ballroom. So we quickly went down the hallway. I said, come on, Isaiah, Joe, let's go. We go to the ballroom. I said, please lay on the floor. Allow yourself to be in this quiet space. And I'm going to take you through a journey. I'm going to take you through a simple process of this is the recovery day. And I'm going to maximize that. This is not a day. This is training, but this is the part of training that most don't get. It's allowing you to come back to center because training camp takes you into all sorts of inflammatory stuff, not just body, but mind. And so we used it as a breathwork day. Probably 70% fell asleep. But within the sleep, they still took something in. And at the end of it, after 1 hour, I had a little chime. I rang the chime. They got up. They all walked out. We did our little namaste. And as they left the room, they each one said, this is just what I needed today. So when I talked to the medical people, the medical staff, they're like, how was the workout? I said, well, it was a different version of a workout, but I think it's what they needed today. And that was my start in the NBA. I think it would have ended if I literally did a workout because nobody would have been able to do, and whatever they already had would have been magnified. So I think it's an example of you have to be able to do anything in this NBA world. And it's never the typical approach. It's never, I know people used to send me a year sample of what their plan was. And I would just laugh and say, wait till you've done this for 15, 20, 25 years. Your plan, you have a general plan, but it veers based upon the relationship you have with the athlete.
There's so much to unpack there. And you gave such great detail and great insight so far. And we're going to get into a bunch of this. I love how you found your curiosity through a personal experience and not just like it's, I feel like you often just hear of people wanting to get into a medical field because they want to help people. And maybe they haven't necessarily experienced wanting to, like maybe they didn't have an injury and stuff like that, but you actually felt that curiosity of wanting to understand health and recovery through a personal experience, which then led you to try and connect with different people doing it in a different way, which it's very fascinating, and I think it's already making connections with how you do things today, at least from what we can see so far. I want to touch back a little bit earlier. So you did play basketball in high school, and grade school. You said you mentioned you grew up in Michigan. Did you grow up like a fan of the Detroit Pistons, and was that like kind of the team that you followed back then?
I would say yes. I mean, in Detroit culture, right, there was Isaiah when he came in the early 80s. There were the Isaiah commercials with his mom and talking about local like electric outings, and his mom would be there. So I think anybody who lived in Detroit was a fan of Detroit basketball. And I think once I started working for the team, like being able to meet George Blaha, right, the guy who is the voice of Detroit basketball, now one of my dear friends for over almost 35 years. And then Isaiah, is like a brother. And, it's just saying Joe Dumars, just when you have, it's funny in sport, often when I talk to people, I'm like, do you stay in relationship with people like, as you mentioned, Detroit basketball? Do you stay in relationship with those that were part of your family? And most are like, nah, not really. Every so often, if something's coming up and I'm like, wow. I mean, for me, it's always been so important. If you're part of this culture, right? If you're part of this family, how real is the family if you don't stay connected or every so often just check in? It's amazing. In today's day and age, it's a text, right? Just a quick check-in. So in answer, I'm kind of going in a very roundabout way of just saying how important that culture was to me of Detroit basketball, and then having the good fortune to be there for a long time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I imagine when it comes to working with a player, a lot of the buy-in has to be building that relationship and having them trust you, because anyone can go to a specialist and have them tell them what to do. But if there's not like trust and buy-in that this process is actually going to benefit them, then it might not be received properly and done and executed as well as it could if by building that trust and relationship there. It's really cool to hear that you still have those connections and relationships from like your earliest years to today, with them still being part of your friendship circle and whatnot. Do you feel like, is that one of the first things you do when you join a new team or receive a new player? Are you building connections, and like, how do you work on building that trust with someone new? Like example, like the Magic just drafted Tristan da Silva, right? Brand new to the organization. What are things that you do early in a player's early start of a career with a new team that you're working with? Like, how do you start to integrate them and build that trust and relationship with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, for example, Tristan, I have a house here in Boulder. So I would often, before working with the Magic, bring NBA players up and we'd go to CU and train. And who do I see in the weight room every day is Tristan da Silva. So I saw him as a freshman, as this really skinny, young kid. And I know the strength coach and the head coach there really well. So watching his progression. And then as we do our background checks and our research, again, it's such a small community. It's such a small world. So being able to reach out to the strength coach, being able to reach out to Tad Boyle, the head coach at CU, we all know each other, right? We all know each other in this business. And so the foundation is relationship. It always is. And I think the first question for me often when I'm first meeting a player, beyond just getting to know them kind of at the root level, is what's worked for you. Whether it's a college player or whether it's a veteran, really what's worked for you. I never want to assume I know more than that athlete. I think it's really important to find what they enjoy, what has worked for them, maybe some of the challenges, what are some of the areas they'd like to improve. And then I can go into what I've seen, what I've witnessed, watching this athlete, talking to other people, so that I can share my side of some things. And hopefully most of the time they match. And I think that's the key. If it just comes from one side of like, hey, here's how we train, here's how we do it, this is the number of years I've done this, blah, blah, blah. I'm really skipping the most important part, which is the human side, and it's the athlete. So I really want to get to know them, know their families, know what's kind of like you asked me, like, where am I from? What are my roots? What has gotten me here? What has gotten Tristan da Silva, at his young age to coming to the Magic, the gift to the Magic, but what were all his? So I got to meet his parents, and which is super cool, right? Getting to see the background and see the mother and the father and their pride and, their love for their child. And you don't skip steps, in this business. There's no skipping steps. And it's the performance side, to be honest, is like the very end point. And it's really all the other things that make this part super easy.
That makes a lot of sense. I see a player like Tristan da Silva who, an older rookie, spent 4 years in college, had a lot more touch points with professional teams and staffs to help him understand good, healthy habits and training processes. But if we look back to last year's draft class, where we have much younger rookies, I think they were drafted, 19 years old, 1 year in college, not nearly the same type of longevity with these bigger staffs, even differences in maturity levels between, a 19-year-old and a 23-year-old. How do you go about working with a player that young and trying to explain the importance of doing things right today, and building in, practices that work for them that will sustain their career and keep them, as healthy as possible, for the length of their career? Because I imagine that it's got to be a little bit more challenging to an extent talking to a 19-year-old versus talking to a 23-year-old or even a vet that's kind of gotten past some of the earlier interest and lifestyle behaviors of a young person compared to like a later 20-year-old.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's not much different. I'll give you an example. So Anthony Black, I guess I still do. I teach at the Top 100 camp. So I've been there the last 6 or 7 years. So you couldn't, if you worked in the NBA, work at the camp. But when I retired from Minnesota my last year, they asked me to come to the camp. So Anthony was at one of the camps, and a bunch of our other players too. So I was fortunate to work with most of the Magic players before they ever became Magic players. And then Anthony Black at the camp was the young man that would come up, shake your hand, look at you in the eyes and say, thank you for working this camp. I have a couple questions I'd love to ask you about this movement thing you were doing out there. And I want to learn more. Hey, could I video it so I could take it home with me? So interestingly enough, when we bring them in for our draft assessment, we go through the simple arm flow movement. That's kind of this brain wake up. Anthony goes, oh, I got it. Let me go through it. Now that was 2 years, 3 years ago, whatever it was. And I'm like, yeah, I remember you. I remember you exactly. I know how hard you work. I know the discipline. I know the family. I know a ton about you beyond basketball. We can all eval basketball, right? That's easy. We can do all sorts of data analysis and algorithms and formulas and analytics. The human side, though, is the side I think that is the more difficult side. But when you really get to shake somebody's hand, look at them. Are we here together, right? Are we really, or are you kind of standing sideways to me? Are you looking down most of the time? And it happens too, but over time, right, there's that trust and confidence. Now, Jet Howard, I've known Jawan since Jawan was in high school. So I have a long history. I knew Jet when he was in diapers. And so that was an easy one for me also. Like I've known Jet. I knew him when he played high school ball. I knew him when he was at college. I know the work ethic. I know what Jawan's about. I know what Janine's about, the whole family. I know Shakira, I know their whole group. So a lot of times with these draft picks, I know most either through somebody directly, indirectly, or I know the agent or something. Because remember, even the agents, I knew when they first came into the sports agency world. So the communication part is so easy. And the conversation I usually have with the 19, 23 or Joe Ingles at 36, right, is routine. And so why that's an easy conversation is we want to maximize your routine starting in this moment, whether it's 36, probably by the time we're done working together, you'll have a slightly different routine and you'll understand it. Because one thing I've seen, it's interesting in basketball, I consulted and I went around, I watched different teams, they would invite me in, and some great systems, really good systems. But I would see this pretty consistently. The players would be doing exactly what they're told, exactly, and doing it really well. And then I would ask a question to the player and like, so do you know why you're doing this? So do you really understand why? And most would look at the person and say, because they told me to do it. And I said, that means you really like them and you respect them. I said, but when you learn what this is doing for you and the why of this relative to basketball, relative to your body, relative to the longevity of your career, you'll accept it and you'll do it at a slightly deeper level. And they would look at me like, whoa, what are you talking about? I'm like, trust me, if you understand how this relates to basketball, not just I'm doing these complex, or what does this relate to the game, right? Versus I'm doing Pilates or I'm doing yoga. How does this relate to basketball? It's the only thing I've done in my career, as a clinician, and then I started working the NBA. So I know if you ask me to do soccer, give me 4 or 5 years, I might figure it out. But basketball, I know pretty well. And I think that's the advantage. So when we're talking this, I could break it down to the game. I could break it down to the nuances of how Tracy McGrady moved, how Isaiah Thomas moved, how Chauncey Billups moved, how Ben Wallace was able to create space, how Dennis Rodman could outrun people, how Grant Hill could outjump. Just so it's not that you have to mention a name or do anything like that. It's more of just the time you've had of doing something that's led to some successes, but more experiences.
That makes a lot of sense. I also imagine that, like, with you growing up and playing basketball, there's a relatability to that as well, and how you're able to connect with the players. And it's not just like, hey, this is why, and this is how it's going to benefit you. But these are also things like I've learned through experience too, on the court and then off the court as well, I imagine. I want to circle back a little bit to some of your other unique approaches, particularly rock climbing. I've seen it on your Instagram where you'll take a player or a couple of them to one of the local climbing gyms in Orlando. I personally grew up rock climbing since 14, was a competitive climber for many years, and now work in the industry myself. And so it's a big passion of mine. And I thought it was so unique to see that you were starting to bring players there to gain that experience. What is it about climbing that, one, attracted you to try the sport and become an avid climber, but two, what do you think this type of cross training does for a basketball player, and how it affects them? Because I imagine they're not becoming climbers, and you're bringing them there to open up their mind to a different element of their body and how it maneuvers and interacts in different movements. But I'd love to hear, just how you got connected with the sport, and then how you think it benefits a player having an experience at a climbing gym.
Yeah. So you're 100% correct. Usually I don't have players climb just because of understanding the complexities of climbing and the risk, right, with climbing also. But a lot of them come to the gym to watch and observe and learn. And we talk about kind of the mental game of climbing. So actually, I've only been climbing. I was fascinated by climbing when I was a youngster, like really young. But in Michigan, there were not many places to climb. So I was more of the guy that would climb out anywhere I could find a tree, right, or a pole or anything that would allow me to do something that required some thinking, figure it out, and then go for it. And then actually my son moved to Boulder here probably 7 years ago, and I came out with him, and that's when I said, oh, wow, Boulder. Like, this is like climbing, one of the climbing capitals of the world. So really learned more so than of the formal climbing. I've always climbed, but now it's like, oh, I could do that on rock. I could do that in a gym. I could do that in a formal way. And then what's really cool here in Boulder is you can be next to like the Michael Jordans of climbing or basketball. So you're climbing next to whatever, Alex Honnold or somebody, and, just see some really amazing climbers, and everyone's supportive of each other. Like, hey, you know what? That was really good what you did there. Do you ever think about going left to the yellow, and it's like, oh, that's a great idea. How it reminds me of basketball is the expansiveness of movement. It's not limited, right? There's constant core tension. So even though I'm going to reach, I can't reach and give something up. And we know in basketball, a lot of times a guy will go and reach and can't grab the ball, or he fumbles the ball. And what I found over the years, I had a player, Zach Levine, when I was in Minnesota, and Zach used to say, Arnie, can you help me when I go up to these strong finishes? I'm losing the ball, my hand strength. And I looked at him and said, Zach, it's not your hands. You've got strong, massive hands. I see you palm the ball. I see you position it. I said, you are losing tension through your core. So when you get bumped, your hand opens and it releases. He goes, no, show me. I said, here, I'm going to hold a noodle, one of these soft noodles, go up for a layup. And I whack in the stomach, and the ball flies out. He goes, that's what happens. I said, so I'm going to introduce you. I said climbing right at the time. And I said, a climber has to hold tension constantly until they're in a space where they can rest for a second. But there's constant tension. Otherwise, the result is a fall, right? If it's bouldering, it's a fall to a mat. If it's rope climbing, the rope will support you. But you have to constantly be in control. You have to be able to neuroprocess and figure out. You can look on the ground and try to think something, but once you get up there as a climber, it all changes. Just like the game of basketball. We have a plan going in, and the whistle blows, and it all changes. And you have to be ready mentally for that. So it's some of the principles of how the body works, but also how the mind works. That to me is the kind of the common thread of basketball and climbing.
That makes a lot of sense. And as someone who's been climbing for over 20 years, 100% right. Like core, balance, it just body placement, it all affects your lower body, affects how your upper body performs, and your core connects it all together. It's really unique. And that's really cool that you bring them there to learn and understand those types of connectivities with the human body and how it all functions. Arnie, we only have a few minutes left until our Zoom is going to expire. So I want to ask a couple of questions to wrap up our conversation together.
Sure.
I want to touch on Detroit for a second, just because you worked with a Magic great, a Magic legend, Stan Van Gundy. What was your experience like with Stan?
I love Stan. Yeah, I love Stan. I mean, he is one of the most intense, passionate coaches that I've had the fortune of working with. So locked in, detailed, like no stones unturned, just a go-getter, so I really, really enjoyed it. Every coach you learn something from, right? I've had, you name it, probably it's a good thing and a bad thing. Usually when you have a lot of coaches, that means sometimes a coach is either gone on for other situations or they're no longer with the team. But I've always learned something from a coach, and definitely from Stan, just his organization and how he ran things, and the discipline and the structure were at highest level it could be.
My last question, as we wrap this up, is, we've talked a lot about your practice and your approach, and how you like to connect with players, and just kind of your thought process going into developing a player's strength and conditioning. When you look at this upcoming season, what are some things that excites you about this team, and what are some things that you've experienced now being with the team for a little while that maybe you haven't been doing that you might want to consider integrating into this season?
Yeah. So first, kudos to my staff, right? That's what I really get excited about. I've got a great staff on the kind of the medical performance, and then the athletic performance, sports science. They do an amazing job. As staffs get bigger, right? We've seen, like, again, in my day, it's one. Now it's 10 to 15 on a staff. The ability to really stay as one thought, one process is crucial, right? So I think us even having a year and a half together brings in even more of like, we've done this, we've done that. Now let's do it at a higher level, right? Where we lock in more. So we know, I call it the Orlando Magic way, right? It was the Detroit Piston way, whatever. And it's like, we want to stand out as unique in what we do, whether it's how we prepare an athlete, how we recover an athlete, how we train an athlete. We want this to be so when an athlete is with us and they're here, they're with another team, whatever, or they come here, they're like, wow, this is unique, this is different. And that's the goal, is to always be able to advance it a little bit, not change it a ton. If you do that, that means you haven't been doing something right. So you want to tweak it a little, but really it's just an advancement of what you've been doing. And I think us having a year and a half under our belt together gives us that opportunity.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's cool that you've built such a team that has really found success with this group. I mean, we've seen it with how you've impacted a player with such a mixed history of health, with Jonathan Isaac having his most successful season, and now going to another healthy off season where he can continue to train and develop his body and focus on his basketball skills, but not necessarily having to recover from an injury. And I think that just speaks volumes to how you and your staff have impacted and brought in a sound program to the Magic organization. Arnie, I really appreciate the time that you've given us today. I wish I had more time to dive in even deeper. We might have to do a follow-up conversation one day. I have a list of questions I didn't even get a chance to ask, but you've definitely brought some really good insights into your process and into your love for health and your journey through it. I guess I want to end with one last question. For anyone who might want to consider getting into the industry that you are in, what is a piece of advice, if you were sitting across the table for them with a cup of coffee or something like that, that you would give a young person wanting to take on this journey?
Yeah, number one, I thank you. That's a great question, because I was kind of that young person, right? The same one. Be willing to think outside the box. You have to master the box. You do. So look, I've had so many people that were strength coaches that I said, go to massage therapy school. You're going to learn so much. And they're like, wait, I'm a strength coach. What are you talking about? I'm like, no. You'll learn about fascia. You're going to learn about how the body moves at a different level. So it's more, can you think of other possibilities to come back to what you really want to do, and never create any limits, right? Never allow that to be part of your vocabulary. There's no limits. It's only possibilities. And especially when you're young, so many people tell you you can't, or, oh, you got to do this, or you have to do that. And I'm like, well, if I followed that path, I wouldn't be here with you right now, right? I wouldn't be in this conversation. So it's always about just honor who you are, get on your path, and just keep going, man. Just keep going, keep pushing, and take deep breaths every so often, just like we do with all our athletes. And my hope is next time we get a chance to do this, I'll have a championship trophy here, so that then we can talk about that extra piece.
I would love that. That'll be amazing. And hopefully that is in the near future for us. Arnie Kander, thank you. Vice President of Player Performance and Wellness. This was a pleasure. I'm very glad we got to connect again. Thank you so much for your time. Magic fans, make sure you continue to give support to Arnie and his team, and obviously the players. This was another episode of The Close Up. I'm your host, Stephen Cameron, and we'll talk soon. Until next time.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you.